Mr. Nixon, maybe I was invited here because I'm a senior citizen and not a retiree, but I work with retired people. And immediately I got in touch with as many as I could in such a short time. You'd be surprised at the letters that did come in asking a few questions. I'm not going to read all these letters, but I would like to read one. Mr. Nixon, it's addressed to you. Last week, Vice President Humphrey announced that if he were elected president, he would increase Social Security benefits by 50% across the board. A suggestion for these increased benefits may be considered by you, and it might be, if this is as she wrote it, of course, a larger increase for the lower and needy bracket and a reasonable increase for the balance. The amount of increase, of course, to be determined by the economic conditions, and a smaller increase for both could be a lesser drain upon the economy. What do you think, she asked?
Well, let me say what I think about Social Security generally and what I think about this proposition and what I think we can do and ought to do. First, I could raise that. I could say, let's raise Social Security benefits 100%. Then it would cost $30 billion rather than $15 billion. And neither is possible at this point. What is possible, of course, is this. One, we've got to stop the rise in the cost of living for the 20 million people over 65. There are 20 million in this country over 65. Most of them live on pensions, life insurance, or Social Security. They have seen, let's suppose that somebody 4 years ago had $10,000 in Social Security, life insurance, or pensions, a total capital of that. That's cut to $9,000 as a result of the increase, the inflation we've had in this country. Now, I think we ought to have a new fiscal policy in Washington, D.C., in which we stop the rise in the cost of living, so that when an individual earns a dollar and puts it into Social Security or into life insurance or in pensions, that then he gets a dollar's worth when he retires 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. And that would be, it seems to me, the most effective thing that we could do for those living on Social Security right now. Stop the rise in the cost of their living and stop the reduction of the capital that they have in their pensions. And then second, I think that we ought to provide, as the Republican platform advocates, and this was as a result of mine and others who recommended it, we ought to provide for an automatic increase in Social Security benefits whenever the cost of living goes up. We should do that. And then third, as and when the economy of this country gets to the place that we can afford to do more without destroying the value of our dollars, then of course we should increase Social Security benefits. Let's understand one thing once and for all. This is a rich country, and this country should be generous with the aged, it should be generous with the needy, it should be generous with everybody who cannot care for themselves. But we also want to remember this. Generosity, when it goes to the point of destroying the value of our dollars, when it raises the prices of the things that we buy, raises our grocery bill, raises our clothing bill, that isn't real generosity. That's robbing the poor. It's robbing the aged. And I think we ought to stop that kind of robbery and reestablish the value of our dollars across this country. Dr. Ferreira.
Thank you. Mr. Nixon, many of my colleagues in the medical profession are greatly concerned about Medicare and what it is doing to the medical profession. They are concerned especially on the potential harmful effect it may have on the quality of medical care to the individual patient. Now, my question is, what specifically is your stand on Medicare, and do you intend to curtail it or increase it?
Let me be very specific on even a broader subject of interest to your colleagues and also to all the people who might be the subjects of Medicare or other kind of medical assistance. First, I support the Medicaid program. I did, of course, when we were in the Eisenhower administration, and I support the Medicare program. However, I disagree with Vice President Humphrey on a key issue. He has advocated, as you know, extending this whole principle of compulsory health insurance to everybody. I'm against that. And the reason I'm against compulsory health insurance for all people is that I don't want to have happen to the quality of medical care in the United States what has happened to it in Britain. Now, I made a study the other day of what had happened in Britain. 1/3 of all the medical school graduates in Britain last year left Great Britain to go practice someplace else. because the quality of care had gone down and because of the red tape of their compulsory so-called free medical program. I want to see that every individual who needs medical care is able to get it, but I want it to be good medical care, and that's why I want to keep the doctors free from government control as much as we can. That is why I oppose the extension to compulsory health insurance on that basis. For the elderly people, Medicare, I think that is certainly an appropriate, and it is a kind of a program that I support. But there's one other point I should make. When we talk about how we're going to extend medical benefits in this country, we have to recognize that before we do any further extending, we've got to get at the other end of the funnel. Because at the present time, I just looked at some figures. There's a shortage of 50,000 doctors in this country. There's a shortage of 75,000 nurses. There's a shortage of 600,000 hospital employees. And the reason for that, and this is another figure that was rather astonishing to me, in the last 10 years, the number of hospital visits has gone from 15 million to 150 million. In other words, a 10-fold increase. So what we need to do, and then my administration will move frontally on this, we need a massive program to develop more doctors, more nurses, more hospital personnel, so that we can provide adequate care for the friends of Mrs. Hall and others who are on Medicare. I don't want to have our older people simply have that slip of paper that gives them the right to go to a doctor and then have them get bad medical care. Let's have them good medical care, and that's the kind of a program I'd be for. Mrs. Clayton.
Mr. Nixon, I'm sure you know that lots of people are concerned that we're moving toward another era of repression of ideas, kind of another search for the internal enemy. And I wonder what, as president, what steps you could or would take to spare us another time of accusations, irresponsible accusations, the hysteria and fear of the old Joe McCarthy time.
Well, Ms. Clover, I would, in the first instance, you can only judge a man by his record. And I would point out with some pride that during the years I served on the House Un-American Activities Committee, I conducted a major investigation, the Hiss case. It's forgotten now, it was 20 years ago. But that case, I think, by most objective observers, was rated as one in which it was a fair, objective investigation. In my view, it is the responsibility of the President of the United States to see, as I pointed out in answer to Mr. Vidmer's question a little earlier, to see that this great engine of dissent is not suppressed by either choking it off or by the blanket of consensus, because that's the only way that we're going to get the spark of creative activity that we want. And as I pointed out in a major speech on the presidency a few days ago, I indicated that I thought that the White House itself should go out and try to get differing points of views expressed from our young people, from people in all walks of life, so that we could get perhaps a better mix of ideas and finally more superior ideas by having them compete with each other. The only line that I would draw in terms of dissent is with regard to the basic question as to whether the individual involved is engaged in activities that are illegal or activities that are aiding an enemy of the United States in the very specific sense. And by that, I do not mean a loose charge that this individual or that individual believes in Marxism or believes in communism and so forth. Let me be quite precise. It doesn't concern me a bit that a teacher, for example, wants to talk about Marxism or communism. We need to know more about Marxism and communism and socialism and all that sort of thing. I think where you draw the line is where the individual, in effect, says, I'm not just going to teach the students about that, but I am going to advocate that the interests of a foreign government be placed above that of the United States. Then I think you have to take a look at it, particularly if that foreign government is involved in military activities against the United States.
Mr. Nixon, we have a division of the world into two ideological spheres, communistic bloc and free world. As a president, will you try to keep this so-called balance of power or raise the Iron Curtain like recently we had the case of Czechoslovakia?
Mr. Krajewski, as president, I would do everything that I could to use the economic and diplomatic strength of the United States to attempt to lift that Iron Curtain a bit, to give some opportunity for some glimmer of freedom and freedom of choice to exist in those countries behind the Iron Curtain. Now, you notice I used the word economic and diplomatic, and I used it quite deliberately because we cannot, at this time with the two nuclear giants facing each other, we cannot suggest that the United States is going to move in with its forces into Czechoslovakia in order to prevent what the Soviet Union did there. But on the other hand, certainly as the United States, when an incident like that occurs, or in attempting to prevent, when we get an early warning, such an incident occurring in some other country, certainly the United States, in terms of its trade policy, in terms of its diplomatic policy, in terms of its moral influence in the United Nations and other areas, has got to stand firmly for the right of these people to choose their own way. That's the reason, for example, that I took the position with regard to the non-proliferation treaty that I did. I'm against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I favor the adoption of that treaty. As president, I expect to implement it after it is approved by the Senate. But I do not believe that the Senate of the United States at this time, while Soviet troops are in Czechoslovakia, should approve that treaty and in effect say that the United States doesn't care what the Soviet Union did to Czechoslovakia. That's one way that we can use our moral influence with the Soviet to indicate to them that while we do want to have negotiations with them, while we do want to have friendly relations, we must make it very clear that we also have a concern for the 150 million people that live in those Eastern European countries. And I remember, incidentally, perhaps the most emotional experience of all my travels abroad occurred in the country of your ancestors, the Polish people. I never forget, after I came back from my so-called kitchen debate with Mr. Khrushchev, we stopped in Warsaw on a Sunday afternoon, and 150,000 Polish people came out that day. And they just threw flowers in the car. They stopped it many times in the heart of the city, and they cried out, "Niech żyje Polska, niech żyje the United States. Long live the United States, long live Poland." That was 10 years after Poland went behind the Iron Curtain. I say that it's when there are people like that in the world, the United States, while we must not do something that is going to set off a nuclear confrontation, we must also make it clear that our thoughts are with them and that we're going to use our economic and diplomatic strength to support their desire for freedom of choice whenever they want it. That's what I believe in, and that's the kind of administration I would have.
Thank you.